The summer of 1887 was unusually hot in the small frontier town of Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Dust covered every wooden porch, horses stamped impatiently outside the courthouse, and the town judge, Silas Granger, was considered the most powerful man for miles. Nobody challenged him, especially not a poor widow or her daughter. 18-year-old Clara Bennett had grown up watching her mother struggle after her father died in a mining accident. Their small ranch was all they had left. When a wealthy landowner named Everett Cole claimed their property belonged to him, Clara discovered something that made her furious. The original land deed had mysteriously disappeared from the courthouse records. Clara's mother, Margaret, begged her not to fight. "Those men have money, lawyers, and friends," she warned. Clara shook her head. "We have the truth." Margaret looked worried. "Truth doesn't always win," Clara answered quietly. "Then I'll make them prove why it shouldn't." On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was packed. Ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, and curious townspeople filled every bench. Judge Granger entered wearing his black coat and silver watch chain. He looked at Clara and smiled coldly. "You intend to represent your mother?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Clara replied. The judge laughed. "You're barely 18. Clara placed several papers on the table. "Old enough to read, Your Honor." A few people in the courtroom chuckled. Granger's expression hardened. "This isn't a schoolhouse. It's a court." Everett Cole stood beside his attorney and confidently presented a copy of the supposed land deed. According to the document, Clara's father had sold the ranch 2 years before his death. Margaret immediately whispered that the signature was false. Clara studied the paper carefully, then looked at the judge. "There is something wrong with this document," she said. Granger leaned back. "Everyone says that when they're losing." Clara didn't argue. She asked permission to examine the original ink and seal. The judge reluctantly allowed it. Clara had spent weeks researching old records at the county library. She discovered that the official territorial seal used on deeds had changed in 1885. The document presented by Cole carried the older seal, even though it was supposedly signed in 1886. The courtroom became silent when Clara pointed this out. Cole's attorney quickly objected. "A young girl cannot determine the authenticity of a government seal." Clara calmly produced a letter from the territorial clerk confirming the seal change. The clerk had also provided a sample of the new seal. The two documents were placed side by side. Judge Granger's face tightened. He knew the case was becoming dangerous. "A clerical mistake proves nothing," he declared. Clara nodded. "Then perhaps we should examine the signature." She had learned that her father always signed his full name, while the disputed document contained only his initials. The judge dismissed the difference as meaningless. Clara wasn't finished. She called an elderly rancher named Samuel Price, who had known her father for 20 years. Samuel testified that Clara's father had injured his right hand months before the supposed sale. "He couldn't hold a pen properly," Samuel explained. Clara then produced her father's medical record. The doctor had written that his hand had been badly injured and remained bandaged for 6 weeks. The date matched the supposed sale exactly. Murmurs spread throughout the courtroom. Everett Cole began looking nervous. Judge Granger struck his gavel. "Enough. These are coincidences." Clara looked directly at him. "Then I have one final question." The judge frowned. "Ask it." Clara held up the deed. "Why does this document contain the judge's personal seal instead of the county recorder's seal?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Granger's face turned pale. Clara explained that she had compared dozens of legitimate deeds. Every official document carried the recorder's seal. The disputed deed carried a small symbol used only by Judge Granger on private correspondence. Cole's attorney immediately objected, but the judge shouted him down. "That proves nothing." Clara calmly replied, "Perhaps not, but I believe the county recorder can explain why his seal is missing." The courtroom doors opened, and the county recorder entered carrying an old ledger. He placed it before the judge. "I checked the records," the recorder said. "There is no entry showing the Bennett Ranch was ever sold." Judge Granger stared at the ledger. Cole suddenly stood. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "The deed is real." Clara turned toward him. "Then you won't mind explaining why you paid the county clerk's assistant $300 3 months ago." Cole's face went white. She produced a bank receipt. The clerk's assistant had secretly given Clara the receipt after realizing he had been used. The assistant was brought into the courtroom. Under questioning, he admitted that Cole had paid him to remove the original deed from the records. He also admitted that Judge Granger had instructed him to keep silent. The room became completely still. Judge Granger rose from his chair. "This court is adjourned." Clara stepped forward. "No, Your Honor." The judge glared at her. "You don't control this courtroom." Clara answered, "Maybe not. But you promised everyone something before we began." Granger looked confused. Clara reminded him of his earlier words. He had sneered that if a widow's daughter could win the case, he would resign as judge. The crowd remembered. Someone in the back laughed. Then another person shouted, "She won." Granger slammed his gavel. "This case isn't finished." Clara pointed toward the evidence. "The case is finished. The land belongs to my mother, and the evidence proves the deed was forged." The territorial marshal stepped forward and placed a hand on Granger's shoulder. Judge Granger stared at him. "You wouldn't dare." The marshal replied, "I already sent a telegram to the territorial authorities." Granger's authority had ended. He was escorted from the bench while Cole was arrested for fraud and forgery. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people gathered. Margaret stood beside Clara, tears streaming down her face. She had expected to lose everything. Instead, her daughter had defended their home using nothing but courage, careful research, and the truth. Samuel Price approached Clara and removed his hat. "Your father would have been proud." Clara smiled through her tears. "I hope so." The old rancher shook his head. He wouldn't just be proud. He'd tell everyone in Wyoming that his daughter was tougher than any lawyer in the territory. Months later, the Bennett Ranch was thriving again. Clara continued studying law, traveling to the county courthouse whenever she could. The people of Red Hollow began calling her the widow's daughter, but the name was no longer spoken with pity. It became a name of respect. Years later, Clara would become one of the first women in the territory to practice law. She never forgot the day Judge Granger mocked her because of her age, her poverty, and her mother's circumstances. She remembered his words exactly. "Win this case, and I'll resign as judge." She had won, and he had resigned. But Clara's greatest victory wasn't watching a powerful man lose his position. It was watching her mother walk back onto the ranch that belonged to her family. The frontier had taught Clara many things, but the most important lesson was simple. Power could frighten people, money could buy silence, and titles could command respect, but none of those things could change the truth. And on that hot Wyoming morning, an 18-year-old widow's daughter had stood before an entire frontier town and proved it.